Before I start this video on Queens, I want to be upfront and say I'm not from Queens. I spent most of my life living in Columbus, Ohio, and I've only been living in Queens for a year and a half. I say this because this means I'm very used to cities like Columbus, where the only viable form of transportation is the car. New York City is my first full experience with a city that can, mostly, be enjoyed entirely via rapid transit. I am still, however, a full proponent of public transit, due to the obvious damage car-dependent society leaves on the urban landscape and the environment, both local and global. The issue is, however, that even with a knowledge of the car's damage on the environment in cities and the benefits of mass transit, I miss my car. I don't even like driving, but I still miss my car. This is something that's often ignored by transit advocates such as the New York Times' Farhad Manjoo. They accurately describe the problems of car dependency, but offer weird utopian visions that feel disconnected from the actual lives of commuters. Manjoo's 2020 article offers many artistic depictions of the road space in Manhattan given over to cyclists, but glosses over what it means for residents to give up their car for a bicycle. I don't say this to criticize Manjoo's proposals. They would make for a better New York City. And this is not me calling out Farhad Manjoo as well. This is me offering an alternative vision to the issue of transit, and particularly the issue of transit in Queens. This video is a visual history of transit in Queens from the perspective of those using that transit, and an analysis of the spatial and abstract relationships one creates both in a car and on the train. I use Queens as the example because, one, it's where I live, and two, it's a very interesting example with a long history of a dual-track development of both highways and rapid transit, going as far back from the 1930s. This is Visions of Queens. Before the 1930s, Queens was rather loosely developed. Now, this is not to suggest there was no transit in Queens before the 1930s, but it was quite patchwork and seat of your pants. Queens was far, far less developed than even a place like Brooklyn in the early 1900s, and the transit options were either the Long Island Railroad, which was not mass transit. It was even more of a conventional railroad then. It was an arm of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and it looked like it. The trains were leftover Pennsylvania Railroad stock, and it used freight as well. It looked like a pretty normal railroad, like the ones you would see in intercity transit. The other option was the streetcar. There was actually quite a bit of streetcar lines in places like Flushing, Jamaica, and Long Island City. However, their operation was patchwork and all over the place. Several different companies owned these transit lines, and it was not very reliable because it would often take a while to get from place to place. The kind of traveling you would do via the Queens streetcar, say from Jackson Heights to Manhattan, is an awfully long distance for a streetcar. The first change you see to Queens is the building of the BMT Astoria line and the IRT Flushing line. Now, when both of these lines were built, there was literally nothing there. As you can see in some of these pictures, the train long predated any form of development. However, it was how development happened. This is where Queens changes from a scattershot, somewhat rural borough into something properly urbanized. The push for the IRT Flushing line and the BMT Astoria line was rooted in the vision of city policymakers. Now, both of these lines were private enterprise. These were private companies, and a lot of the people who benefited from it were real estate speculators who could now build large money-making apartment blocks next to these lines. However, it did solve a problem that city planners had in New York, that way too much of the population was trapped in Manhattan. For a long, long time, way too much of New York was trapped in lower Manhattan, meaning awful tenement conditions. This was a way for New York to become less dense and for its quality of life to improve. In the 1920s, as the Flushing line was finished, city planners in New York City saw the automobile as the future of transit in New York. The most prolific city planner with this vision was Robert Moses. Moses was initially an outsider to New York City politics, but was soon able by the 1930s to command the funds necessary to build bridges, tunnels, and highways, all for the automobile. Queens was not the only borough blessed with Moses' highways, but it was the borough most defined by their presence, as it was the most sparsely populated one. Moses' highways, however, had a different feel then than they do today. Grand Central Parkway, for example, was elaborately tree-lined, and it was intended as a pleasurable motoring experience away from the crowded urban space. The infamously racist Moses, however, always intended his infrastructure to be mostly used by white, well-to-do New Yorkers who could afford a car. Buses were not allowed on his parkways, a fact well remembered through the low stone bridges that remain today over Grand Central Parkway. While Moses seemed all-powerful, the decentralized nature of New York City administration meant that there was an opportunity for a parallel vision of Queens in the IND subway. The I&D subway was conceived by city officials who were sick of the private ownership of the subway, and some who truly believed that train rapid transit was still the future of New York City. In 1920, Daniel L. Turner issued a plan for 830 miles of new track, including an 8-track 8th Avenue subway. The eventual I&D built in the 1930s, however, was hardly as ambitious. Unlike previous subway extensions, the I&D mostly served already developed areas, and was seen as a complement to most of its highways, not a competition. The I&D Queens Boulevard line, however, quickly became a backbone of Queens rapid transit. Like with previous subway lines like the IRT Flushing, Queens Boulevard and the surrounding area wildly changed with the introduction of the subway. Despite the full urbanization of Queens over the past 90 years, its transit network remains in the 1930s mold of Moses and the I&D. There have been widenings and renovations, but the most major change over the last 90 years has been the addition of the SkyTrain to JFK. While lacking innovation, the arrangement set in the 1930s does work to this day. Queens is an economic powerhouse and a consistent driver of New York's growth. The future, however, may not be so kind. Climate change is a threat to the planet and New York City, and this is driven in no small part by automobile pollution. Queens must get drivers off the road to have a livable climate future. The solution to this, however, is currently being endangered by climate change. The subway flooded 3 times in the summer of 2021, and that pattern shows no signs of slowing down. While it has largely worked for 90 years, the dual-track transit of highways and trains in Queens must give way to a more robust and better funded train rapid transit system. To do this, we need to convince Queens residents to abandon their cars. And to do that, we need to understand what connections that residents make to their transit choices and what needs to change from there. To better understand these connections, I went out and used both forms of transit, and these are my findings. I don't have a car here in Queens, so I requested the help of my Aunt Janice and Uncle Mike in their vehicle. Their help is greatly appreciated, and naturally this video is dedicated to them. The highways of Queens give one an intimate, abstract connection to New York City at large. The highways of Queens, except for Grand Central Parkway near St. John's University where it dips down, lift drivers up and provide unparalleled views of the New York urban space. The best way to view the Unisphere is not in Flushing Meadows Park, but from Grand Central Parkway. Not merely as well are you on a road to Manhattan, you see Manhattan as you drive. From your car, you get nearly perfect views of the Empire State Building and the World Trade Center. As you see these views, which are often impossible for pedestrians, you obtain a unique motorist connection to New York City. More than the skyline, you get to look at whole neighborhoods, entire rows of apartment houses and landmarks along the way. Paradoxically, however, as you feel the city getting smaller due to your views of the urban space, you are isolated from actual New Yorkers. This is, however, the core appeal of the car. You are a connected urban resident, a part of the fabric of the city that you can see right before your eyes and you can get to. But you don't have to ever interact with residents you might not like. When you ride the Queens Boulevard subway, you are crowded into small tunnels, and the first thing you notice is your fellow New Yorkers. What there is to look at architecturally, the tiled designs of the I&D stations, are spare and mostly there to be looked at from a glance from a speeding train. These designs are unchanged from the 1930s, so there is a historic authenticity that one can gain from there, but perhaps that's lost on commuters who are far more used to the subway system than I. The designs of stations and the outside of the train cars in general is quite marginalized once you actually enter the train. The bench seating arrangement is inherited from the old IRT trains and is optimized for people standing up as the train fills up in rush hour. Even on the elevated 7 train, it's difficult to see outside the train, making one hyper-aware of those riding with you. Performers, like the ones I encountered here during my ride, take advantage of this and use the subway as a stage. As well, the isolation of the train car and the simplicity of the stations make the subway feel like a world unto itself. The design of the Forest Hill station, for example, has no visual connection to the elaborate brick neo-Romanesque neighborhood above it. This becomes especially jarring once one gets to Manhattan, and there is a wild visual disconnect between the world above ground and the world below ground. More than sharing space with other residents, one feels alienated from the world above them, and even the world below them on elevated lines. This experience makes one feel that the car is the more freeing experience. Given these observations, I made a list of recommendations about making the subway more appealing for people making the switch. Number 1, clean the stations. This is more than just sweeping litter and dirt. It's removing rust, keeping paint clean, and fixing tiling. This is easier said than done, especially with budget cuts in the number of stations, but clean-looking stations would greatly help the subway's reputation immediately. Number 2, rearrange the city. I recommend changing the seating arrangement and window placement to something more like the Berlin U-Bahn, so that all seats have a window view. Now, I understand why the bench seating exists and the things they wish for rush hour traffic. However, it results in a very isolated train environment, and you just awkwardly look at your fellow residents, who you're not supposed to look at if you ask New Yorkers. So I think making more window seats, making it so you can actually see out the train and connect with what's there, even if it's just a tunnel, is an improvement. Getting a view of a passing express train is a much better experience than looking right at the person in front of you, who probably doesn't want you to look at them to begin with. Number 3, more local touches. The NYU Ape Street station is a good example of doing this without radically changing the station. Here you see tile designs that depict what is above ground, like the Washington Square Arch. Art such as the hats you see here are cute, but ultimately don't help with the alienation factor. Connections in the physical space to the neighborhood above the station helps with alienation. Number 4, make driving harder. Driving is already miserable in New York, as evidenced by how slow we are moving, but making it worse might motivate people to ditch the car even without subway improvements. This is a necessary complement to the quality of life recommendations I made above. No matter how attractive you make the subway, Queens residents will keep their car routines if nothing prevents them. The lane reductions that Frad Manju recommended last year will be needed to complement the renovations and the expansions of the subway going forward. This can't be the only option, but it is a necessary option. Number 5, defend the subway. I've been critical of the subway in this video, but I want to reiterate how important it is and how much better a form of transit it is compared to Moses' highways. New Yorkers should continue to criticize the subway, but always remember that the solution is to make the subway better, not to abandon it. When you watch the local news with friends or family about crime on the subway, remind them that the amount of injuries car accidents cause is far more numerous than any subway crime. The subway saw 1,626 major felonies in all of 2020. There were 2,644 people injured or killed in New York City car accidents in June of 2020 alone. The subway has to be the future of Queens transit in the future. And thus, we have to modernize it, and just as importantly, defend it as our future. Thank you.